Okay. Now, with your permission, I would like to introduce you.
Thank you.
David Gardner is the recently retired president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Prior to that, Dr. Gardner was for nearly 10 years the president of the 9-campus University of California. He served as the 10th president of the University of Utah. In 1981, U.S. Secretary of Education Bell appointed Gardner chairman of the National Commission of Excellence on Education, whose 1983 report, A Nation at Risk, many of us read that report, and it's a very important report. It helped spark the national effort to improve and reforming schools in the United States. Dr. Gardner has also served on several national commissions concerning with higher education. He's a member of the National Academy of Education and the American Philosophical Society, and fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and National Academy of Public Administration. Dr. Gardner has also served as chairman of the Board of Trustees of the J. Paul Getty Trust in Los Angeles, California. His memoirs, Earning My Degree, Memoirs of an American University President, will be available from the University of California Press in January 2005. And from what I heard from Sheldon and Martin about Dr. Gardner, I recommend strongly to everybody to buy the book. So now, please, would you please start your address? And following the address, we'll have probably questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tadmore, for your generous and warm introduction. I deeply regret that untoward circumstances have prevented me from being with you in person, as had been my fervent but now unavailing hope. Perhaps this paper and the ensuing question and answer period will help you comprehend the intricacies of governing and managing the University of California within the structure of public and private higher education in that state, and the political, fiscal, educational, and cultural norms of contemporary California. May I say in beginning my remarks how appreciative I am that Professors Troe and Rothblatt are with you in person, as they are as familiar with this material as I am, indeed, if not more so. I would also, if I may, Professor Tadmore, thank the technical people in Israel, as I do those in Lanai, Hawaii, for effectuating this arrangement so that I could join you this morning. The rapid growth and development of the University of California to the rank of the world's most preeminent, distinguished, and best balanced public university is one of the most dramatic and telling events in the annals of American higher education, especially having in mind that the university was founded only 136 years ago in 1868. Until the late 1950s, California's public system of higher education, as to number of campuses and their location, was mostly about local community ambitions, regional economic interests, and provincial pride. Almost every session of the California legislature at that time witnessed unplanned, nearly random, and highly politicized decisions to locate a new community college here and a new state college there. There was no underlying state policy about such matters, or a framework for more reasoned and conceptually coherent decisions. Clark Kerr's appointment as UC's president in 1958 changed all of that. In that year, Kerr gathered together California's leading educators to take on the issues of growth in the public and private segments of California higher education. They studied the expansion of existing campuses, the adding of campuses, the governing structures of the community colleges, the state colleges, and the University of California, and the distribution of students across them, the assignment of institutional missions, admission standards, and related matters. The result of this effort was to be a treaty of sorts, drawn up by the leaders of California's public and private colleges and universities, now renowned as the California Master Plan for Higher Education, enacted in 1960 by the California State Legislature and signed by the governor. Thus, California led the nation in developing a three-tier system of higher education that has been studied worldwide as a possibility for those states or countries wishing to increase access to higher education while improving its overall quality. With minor changes, the plan has remained in force to this very day. Having in mind the theme of our conference, I would offer the following comment. It should be noted that the Master Plan for Higher Education in California could never have been conceived by the apparatus of state government, much less implemented. Never. It required not government, but the voluntary collaboration of the leadership of the state's public and private institutions of higher education to accomplish this task. Differences among and between these institutions, and there were plenty of them, were resolved by colleagues, not by politicians. The plan, when made acceptable to the higher education community, then became acceptable also to the governor and the legislature. In essence, the master plan assigned an academic mission to each of the three parts of the public higher education system, while encouraging the further growth and development of the state's private colleges and universities. It also defined the pool of students who were to be eligible for admission to each of these three segments, and differentiated the expected sources of funding for each of the three as well, roughly as follows. The two-year community colleges, of which there are today 111, were to be open-door institutions, offering a general education to students wishing to transfer to one of the state's four-year institutions as third-year students, and providing programs for those interested in technical, vocational, and other skill-related fields. The adult learner was also to have a call on these colleges, which were to be open not only to high school graduates, but to anyone 18 years of older who might benefit from attending them. They were to be essentially cost-free to students and funded from a mix of state and local sources. The system was to be overseen by a board of governors, whose members were appointed for 6-year terms by the governor with the Senate's concurrence. The second tier was to be comprised of the California state colleges, then part of the state's Department of Public Instruction. They were to draw their students from the top 1/3 rather than from the top 1/2 of California's high school graduating seniors, not by high school, but taking the pool of high school graduates for the state as a whole and applying that percentage. The California state colleges became an independent system at that time and are today known as the California State University, California State, San Francisco, Cal State, San Jose, Cal State, Los Angeles, San Diego, and so forth. And there's some 22 campuses. The colleges were to offer a full range of undergraduate programs, leading to a baccalaureate degree, and a select number of offerings at the master's level, mostly in professional fields, such as education and engineering. Research was to be more applied than basic, and tied to the institution's comprehensive teaching function. Funding was to be provided chiefly by the state, and governance was vested in a board of trustees appointed for 6-year terms by the governor with the concurrence of the Senate. The third tier was the University of California's place in the scheme of things, and this was confirmed by reference to the pertinent provisions for governance embodied in the state constitution and the derived authority of the regents. The pool of students eligible for admission was modestly reduced from the top 15% of graduating high school seniors to the top 1/8 or 12.5%. The university was to offer a comprehensive undergraduate curricula leading to the baccalaureate degree, a corresponding array of master's degrees, and doctoral level work for the PhD in all fields, including the tertiary degrees for the professions. UC was to be the state's primary agency for research and a provider of public service to the society at large. Funding was to come, not in any specified proportions, but from the state, the federal government, student fees, and tuition for non-resident students, self-supporting operations such as residence halls, bookstores, and so forth, university hospitals and clinics, private gifts and grants, income from endowments, and an array of other miscellaneous sources. As the University of California played the critical and leading role in negotiating this plan, it also had a special obligation when enacted to honor it. Now, the University of California was and is, discussing the university's governing management and principles within the larger context I've just described, was and is one of the world's most complex and sophisticated institutions, the largest and best of its kind, now enrolling some 208,000 students on 10 campuses, with an annual operating budget of $14 billion, not including the costs associated with managing for the federal government 3 national laboratories at Los Alamos, Livermore, and the Berkeley Laboratory. That's another $4 billion. UC employs nearly 170,000 persons, manages 5 major medical centers, clinics throughout the state, and as the state's land-grant institution, it has agricultural field and experiment stations throughout California and a county extension service serving agriculture in that state in every county. It is a formidable enterprise to govern and manage, not only because of its public character, but more because of the work it does and of the highly educated and independent people who do it and on whom the university's reputation in the end rests. The university does not welcome much management and regards the exercise of administrative leadership as an oxymoron. Its internal affairs are exquisitely balanced, generally speaking, I should say, exquisitely balanced, within a well-tested and much commended system of shared governance. Shared, that is, between the administration and the academic senate. Each of these bodies possesses authority independent of the other, derived by way of direct delegations of authority from the governing board, the Board of Regents. I should mention that in California, the California Constitution makes provision for 3 branches of government, the usual ones, the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. But in California, there's a 4th branch of government, and it's the University of California, and therefore has a constitutionally independent position. That means that the legislature, when it appropriates money to the university, and I might add they don't have to appropriate any money at all, but when they do appropriate it, they can't indicate how any of it's to be spent. It's against the law to do that, against the Constitution to do that. Rests with the regents to make that judgment. In other words, the university's founders had vested in the Board of Regents the unqualified authority to govern the new university and fixed on the board a constitutional mandate to keep the university free of sectarian and political influence in its internal affairs. They were equally determined to put as much distance as possible between the university's constitutional autonomy and the legislature's judgment about university operations, programs, policies, teaching, research, and public service. In other words, the university was to be insulated from the swirling winds of partisan politics, but for the most part, quite understandably, define the actions of legislatures. Now, these constitutional provisions have been mostly honored over the years, both by the regents and the legislature. And when there have been differences, they have been litigated, or the university simply ignores unconstitutional requirements laid on them by the legislature. This single protection and provision for UC's autonomy is shared with only a handful of other American universities, and in the instance of the University of California is the first reason accounting for its rise to eminence, especially within such a brief period of time. The second reason was the Regents' decision in 1920 to delegate direct and full authority to the Academic Senate over courses of instruction and curricular requirements, and for the setting of UC's academic standards for student admissions, subject to regeneral concurrence. In addition, the Academic Senate has been delegated a major, but not a final role in academic personnel decisions, working collaboratively with the academic departments, schools, and colleges, and with UC's senior academic officers. The discretion of these senior academic officers may in the end be absolute, but their authority is exercised with great, nearly unexceptional deference to faculty judgment in the matter of appointments, promotions, demotions, and terminations of individual members of the faculty. The Academic Senate was also given the right to organize itself and its committees as it sees fit, and to elect its officers and committees as it collectively chooses, without interference from either the university's administrative officers or the regents. It is the fact of a strong academic senate and a strong administration working with separately delegated authority within UC's labyrinth of overlapping but distinguishable processes and policies that explains the second reason for the university's strength, resilience, quality, and adaptability. The third reason lies in the Board of Regents' willingness to delegate nearly all of its constitutional authority to the President. And the President, in turn, at least since 1958, when President Kerr came into office, to the chancellors of UC's 10 campuses. The role of the President of the University of California is pivotal to the sustainability of the university as a single institution, the effective functioning of the university's Board of Regents and of the Academic Council, the securing and allocation of UC's resources, the appointment of its key officers, the coherent exercise of its executive powers, the preservation of its constitutional autonomy, and the discharge of its ceremonial and symbolic obligations, both domestically and internationally. The President holds the single position within the university that is accountable for the totality of its endeavors. The chancellors and vice presidents being responsible for a single campus in the case of the chancellors, or specialized functions in the case of vice presidents. The president of the university is the one who promulgates university-wide policies, consistent with the authority delegated by the regents to that office, or formulates and recommends to the Board of Regents the enactment of new policies, or the revisions to or rescissions of ones already in place. Under the university's administrative structure and system of shared governance, the president is both the university's chief executive officer and its chief academic officer, but exercises the former function in full and the latter only rarely, given the authority of the Academic Senate in these matters. Now, the chancellors on each campus are in essence the chief operating officers for their respective campuses. They report directly to the president. They are appointed by the regents on the recommendation of the president. They command both visibility and regard within the campus community of which they're a part, and in the city or community hosting it. They have access to an extended family of interested parties and constituents, such as alumni, donors, local legislators, the professional and business interests within the service and commercial radius of the campus, and of course the students studying there, and their parents. The university's principal constituents tend to identify with the campus where they've been students, or where their children had studied, and whose athletic fortunes they followed, or whatnot, whereas the president, one step removed from the university's real work, had collective responsibility for all 9 campuses. The university's 5 vice presidents, while not line officers, were an indispensable part of UC's administrative structure. Their roles, however, were to assist the chancellors with their interpretation or administration of university-wide policies, to work with the campuses in the preparation of items for the regents, to advise me on issues within their respective areas of responsibility, to communicate with the regents as required, and to oversee the operations and the work of their respective staffs in the areas assigned to them. There were 5 vice presidents, 1 for academic affairs, 1 for administration and finance, 1 for university relations and budget, agriculture and natural resources, and health sciences. They were not line officers, they were staff officers. Okay. It cannot be said that UC's administrative officers lack authority. They possess it in abundance, and tempered by the realities of shared governance on the one hand and a strong independent Board of Regents on the other, have come to act in a deliberative, consultative, professional, and collegial fashion that has steadied the university during times of travail, but not hindered it in its forward momentum when more favorable conditions prevailed. Now, the 4th reason is the Board of Regents itself. There are 26 regents governing the university, 18 of whom are appointed by the governor. They serve for 12 years, presumably so no one governor can control the board. 7 of the regents serve by virtue of other positions they hold: the governor, the lieutenant governor, speaker of the assembly, which is the lower house of the legislature, superintendent of public instruction, president of the alumni association, vice president of the alumni association, student regent, and the president of the university. All 26 have the right to vote on any and all issues coming to the board. Members of the faculty are represented by 2 of their number, with the right to sit at the board, participate in all discussions, but without the right to vote, which was at one time offered to the academic senate, but they rejected it because they wanted to be able to represent their views and not have a larger responsibility. Now, the regents retain the authority to appoint the president, and on recommendation of the president, to appoint the university's vice presidents, chancellors, directors of the national labs, and other key officers. They reserve the authority to recommend UC state funding for the operating and capital budgets to the governor, to approve the functionality of buildings, to accept gifts and contracts and grants over a certain amount, to fix tuition levels for students, to close or approve new campuses, schools, and colleges, to adopt resolutions for or against ballot initiatives or propositions of vital interest to UC, to judge the performance of their officers, and to fix their compensation, to oversee the audit function, and to amend their own bylaws. How the regents met their responsibilities, interact with the president and key administrative officers, organize their work, and make decisions also needs to be understood, and we can elaborate on that in the question and answer if you would like. I had to allow not only for the ideologies and personalities of each of these 25 people, but for the procedures they followed and the governing precepts they honored. These I had to understand as completely as possible, or I would be incapable of commanding either their confidence or the chancellor's, vice presidents, or the faculty's regard. The regents, of course, did not live in our world. Most of them lived in a corporate legal culture, and the university's academic culture sometimes produced impatience, lack of understanding, and unneeded controversy. Moreover, they were political appointees, however distinguished they may have been, except for the ex officio members, but at the same time were expected to safeguard the university's political neutrality, even though being beholden, at least in part and early on in their service, to the political forces that led to their serving as regents. Time tended to socialize regents to their duty, however, with the longest-serving regents often being the most independent, and for that reason, the most effective. Individually and collectively, for over 13 decades, the regents have been real champions and protectors of the university, dedicated to its welfare, jealous of its autonomy, demurring to presidents and the Senate on most matters, and asserting their constitutional role when needful in encounters with the governor and legislature. Now, the 5th reason has been the steady and diligent commitment to the University of California as a single university, operating on 10 campuses, These are not 10 separate universities. It's not a federation. It's a single university. In the corporate sense, it is a single entity, governed by a single Board of Regents, possessing nearly unqualified constitutionally derived authority, adopting its own bylaws, and delegating what authority it wishes to its officers through standing orders adopted by the Board. There is one president, appointed by the Regents, to whom sufficient authority is given to exercise UC's central executive authority. There's one academic senate operating on each campus, but also university-wide, whose members comprise a unified and comprehensive, but not representative, academic senate, the senate being composed essentially of the professoriate and key administrative officers. There's a single consolidated university budget. And I might add, it's by object of expenditure. You cannot discern from the operating budget how much money is going to any given campus. This is important. It's important for purposes of getting it through the board without geographic and more provincial views being dominant, and getting it through the legislature with local interests not therefore dominating the overall discussion. When it's submitted to the legislature and the governor, and when acted on, it comes back to the university as a block grant. And it's allocated within the university by the president, not by the regents. When the money comes back to the university, the president allocates it and reports that decision to the governing board. That is also critical. And it's allocated according to policies that are worked out collaboratively by the university administration, that is the president and the chancellors. There's a single set of personnel policies, salary schedules, and policies for UC faculty and other academic personnel, university-wide negotiations with the unionized staff, common fees and charges for students, except for some campus-specific programs or facilities where there are modest differences. There's a single official university voice speaking for UC in the state capital, under direction of the president, and involving both members of his staff in Sacramento and others from throughout the university, helping to insulate the campuses from direct political interference. In other words, on a capital budget for our building program, you do identify the campuses because these are specific buildings, unlike the operating budget where it's an object of expenditure budget, not campus specific. There's always room for mischief under those conditions, with one campus seeking to improve its position compared with another. Any chancellor who did that directly or could be proved to have done it indirectly would be out of a job the next day. So there's some self-discipline within the system. The sixth reason pertains to the common university standards for admission at the freshman level. 12.5% of the high school graduates in the state, thus assuring UC a student body possessing exceptional promise and ability. The seventh reason, I should add there's only one more after this, the seventh reason for UC's worldwide standing is its relationship to the people of California, however they may be perceived worldwide. Californians are proud of its accomplishments, appreciative of the university's role, honored to be part of its success, and or to have studied on one or more of its campuses. The public, on balance and over time, has been willing to pay for UC's overall excellence and ambitions, even when furious with its tolerance for protest. For example, in 1964-65, during the free speech movement, from 65 to 71, in demonstrations against the Vietnam War, or with its apparent unresponsiveness to public concerns about the nation's security, as in the McCarthy era in the late 40s and early 50s. The eighth and final reason for UC's rise has been its steady development of multiple sources of revenue, rather than a simple reliance on state funds alone, for its operating and its capital budgets. These other funds include federal funds for research, public service, and student financial aid, student tuitions and fees for an array of student-focused programs and activities, private support for scholarships and fellowships, endowed chairs, library and museum collections, intercollegiate athletics, and a range of non-state funded capital needs, and revenue from self-supporting auxiliaries. Now for a more general and final comment to close the formal parts of my remarks, looking forward to the questions and answers. One often reads in the higher education literature in America that university presidents are powerless, that the faculties are hopelessly resistant to change, that the unions have immobilized the staff, that the students attack whatever the administration does, and that the governing boards afford the president precious little discretion while holding them responsible for virtually everything, while rewarding the guilty and punishing the innocent. I did not find these pessimistic, if not cynical, assertions to be in the least bit true in the 20 years I served as a president. Not at Utah, not at California. University presidents not only have very substantial authority in the United States, but also possess influence and power, though none of which makes much difference if not boldly exercised and fully engaged. These claims assume that the incumbents are self-starters, willing to act, conscious of the strengths and weaknesses of others, just as they need to be aware of their own, content to internalize their successes and to absorb and learn from their failures, willing to take advice or turn it away, happy to work long hours and able to walk away from the job for the sake of the institution, willing to say no or yes according to one's best judgment, willing to endure a certain isolation and the disgruntled and fault-finders, willing to balance one's personal life with the demands of the job, or lose one or the other or both, and deeply committed to the purposes, values, and culture of these rare and remarkable institutions that form so crucial, indeed so indispensable, a part of modern civilization. This is not to say that things work well all the time, or the mistakes are not made, or the poor choices do not have enduring consequences, or there are not ample bumps and barriers along the way, or the presidents do not err or fall short of expectations. Nevertheless, leadership counts in our colleges and universities, as it does in other major institutions in our society. These institutions and their leaders should be ahead of the curves of change, and not back of them. For only in this way can these institutions expect to be drivers of their own future, rather than governed by the decisions of others, less informed and less caring about them. The California Master Plan for Higher Education 1960 is a prime example of such leadership, as is UC's own quite autonomous position within its host state. Leadership, risk-taking, ambition fitted the day's realities and aspirations suited to the society and culture of which these institutions are a part, are fitting challenges for the leaders of our universities and those in government and the private sector who wish to help, and in the end, whose support is indispensable. Professor Tadmore, a bit longer than I expected, but I do some questions and answers. Will you?
Thank you very much for a superb address, so timely and appropriate for us here, which in some respect I feel sometimes that we are in the pre-Clark period, and I only wish that we could here in this country emulate some of the successes that you had in California. So now let's start the question period. Professor Schachter.
Mordecai Schechter, President of Tel Hai Academic College. I just want to repeat what Zev said now. Usually we say that we are behind 10 to 15 years behind the U.S. It seems that in the area of higher education, at least part of it, we are about 50 years behind the U.S., realizing the situation that we face. But I want to ask you this. You described the system of the University of California as a very cohesive, integrated system, and my impression is that the various campuses, we take Berkeley, Davis, UCLA, I mean, after all, don't they compete for students? How do they compete for students? Do they compete for funds? Is it all that centralized as the way you described it? I know they compete in sport matches, but I'm sure there are other areas and spheres of competition among the different campuses, contrary to the maybe wrongly the impression that I got from your presentation.
Thank you very much for those questions and observations. They do indeed compete for students at the undergraduate level, but not too aggressively, because there's such an overwhelming desire on the part of eligible students to attend the University of California that there's never a problem of filling the class. For example, students in California who wish to apply to a campus of the University of California can apply to more than one of them at once. So a student can apply coming out of high school to Berkeley, to UCLA, to San Diego, to Davis, to Santa Barbara, whatever. Each campus will consider the application within the context of their existing student body and the nature of the applicant pool for their campus. They will then make judgments. Generally speaking, the way it works, and this is an overgeneralization, but you get the idea, the first 40 to 60% of the class is admitted on the basis of objective academic criteria. Courses in high school, grade point average in those courses required for admission, and test scores. The second half, assuming they're eligible, that is within the top 1/8 or 12.5%, other criteria are considered. Each campus wants to get a geographic spread from within the state. So they want students from every county. They want them from the farms, from the suburbs, from the inner cities. They want them from all socioeconomic groups, from all races and ethnic groups. Not in any particular proportions, but they want them represented because they're admitting a class, not just individual students. And California is a very diverse place. So the university student body really should be too. This is a huge argument as to how it actually should be brought about, but I'm giving you the principle that underlies the various solutions people have been offering for the disagreements that they have with one another.
Thank you very much.
So the competition for undergraduates is not a big problem. There is competition for the graduate students, however, and competition in the professional schools like law and medicine. But even then, the demand is so great for enrollment that it's not a big problem. As to the funding competition, there's enormous competition, but it's internal. The campuses pushing hard on the president for their particular interests, the chancellors leaning on the president for their interests, every campus doing that. The president expects every chancellor to do that. They should be doing that, but once the decision's made, they need to be in the game. And that's how it works.
Thank you. Yes, Judith Birk.
Judith Birk. I'm chairing the committee for appointment of professors in the colleges, academic colleges, and I would like to ask about the California State universities. What is the teaching load of the faculty, and do they have research facilities?
Yes, thank you. The actual teaching load varies tremendously from department to department. For example, the teaching load for those in the Department of History is higher than the teaching loads, say, for those in the Department of Physics. But the amount of sponsored research for the average professor in the Department of Physics is much higher than for the Department of History. And there are differences across the university and among it between campuses. And the central administration does not undertake to fix those ratios in any way whatsoever. Those are managed by each campus within the context and within the balance of research and teaching, public service, that is characteristic of that campus. And it does vary. The proportion of freshmen and sophomores to juniors and seniors, the proportion of undergraduate students to graduate students, the number of professional schools, and so forth. So the profile of each campus is different, and therefore these ratios vary from campus to campus. So you can make some general statements, but there are exceptions to every rule. Now, the way the university is funded is on the basis of a generalized student-faculty ratio. Today, it's about 20 to 1. And when I was president, it was about 17.5 to 1. So things have been tough financially, at least in our terms. And therefore, we get so much money from the legislature for every 20 students. And the amount of money is calculated on a formula that's fitted to our mission under the master plan. The formula for the California State University is different. and the formula for the community colleges is different than either one or the other. And so we get funded for a full-time faculty member with all the benefits associated with the position, compensation, benefits. We get it for the pro rata share of the library costs, the departmental costs, the central administration costs, the computer costs, the capital facilities costs, depreciation schedules, all of that. It's worked out. So they don't care what level they are studying. They just give us so much money for every 20 students. The university, on the other hand, internally allocates it very differently, taking account of not only the point you raise, but the profile of each campus in terms of its teaching and research.
Neil Sherman.
Neil Sherman, United States Israel Educational Foundation, the Fulbright Commission in Israel. Professor Gardner.
I have a hard time hearing this. I'm
sorry. Neil Sherman, United States Israel Educational Foundation, the Fulbright Commission here in Israel. You mentioned that the master plan was only ratified by the legislature, that in fact the key to its success was the agreement among the institutions themselves. I wonder if you could say a few words about maintaining the consensus, what you had to do as president to keep peaceful relations with the other elements of the system and keep the understandings of the master plan from eroding.
Well, that's a very good question. I appreciate your asking it because it will provide the answer I hope will provide some further insight into the nature of these dynamics. The master plan is reviewed about every 10 years by the legislature. After this formal review, generally speaking, they find it to be an agreeable arrangement. There have been some exceptions. The regents used to serve for 16 years to guarantee that no one governor could control the board. The legislature in the mid-'70s proposed an amendment but to reduce the period of service from 16 years to 12. That was driven by the Democrats, only to find out in about 15 years that the Republicans then controlled the board and they wanted to make it back to 16. But it's one of those things. But every time the legislature has looked at the master plan, they have not been able to come up with anything that they think is in general more satisfactory than that. Now, we have a continuous fight on this because the legislature will want us to do something and we won't want to do it. And I'll give you an example of how this works, and I think it will answer your question in the broader sense. I was a young staff person at the University of California at Santa Barbara during all the student unrest in the late 1960s. Charlie Hitch was president. We had proposed Governor Reagan was then governor of California. As governor, he attended the regents' meetings as a regent. The Speaker of the State Assembly, the lower house of the legislature, was also a regent, ex officio. He also attended. They were sitting across from one another. Reagan was a Republican, this other person was a Democrat. The university had proposed a budget that Reagan had not been willing to support, and therefore proposed a budget that was woefully inadequate. Thanks to the Speaker of the Assembly, sitting across the table from Reagan, the budget was dramatically improved. So President Hitch, in reporting the budget to the full Board of Regents at this meeting, observed this dynamic. And Governor Reagan was sitting there scowling, and the Speaker of the Assembly was beaming, very happy, smiling. Hitch then went on to say, but of course there's a rider that went on the bill for appropriations, which direct the regents to reverse themselves on a decision made earlier that year to close the School of Criminology at Berkeley. So the legislature accompanied its appropriation with language demanding that the regents reinstate the Graduate School of Criminology at Berkeley. So President Hitch said, I want to simply observe that in addition to the budget, there was this rider. And of course, as Regent so-and-so, the Speaker of the Assembly, knows, the rider is patently unconstitutional. It's within the prerogative of the board to decide what schools and colleges are to be, not the legislature's judgment. And I have no intention of raising this issue again with the regents. nor do they have any intention of reconsidering the issue. Well, at that point, the Speaker of the Assembly was scowling, and Reagan was beaming. So that's how we try to do it. That's the best way I can describe it. Be even-handed, both parties, nonpartisan.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that question, that was fascinating that the master plan really came out bottom up. It was built up by an agreement, as you said, between the institution, universities, colleges. How that exactly developed? What was the dynamics of that process? Because I think perhaps it's time here for us to create such a process.
Well, the way it was handled in California in 1960, really 1958, 59, and then enacted by the legislature in 1960, Kerr was the driving force, but he did not chair the task force that reviewed this. That was chaired by Arthur Coons, who was president of Occidental College in Southern California, which is a private liberal arts college. So we asked the president, a very distinguished, well-regarded person of a private institution, to chair the group that had responsibility for mediating the differences among and between the public higher education system. This group worked for about 18 months, and they had issues of mission, eligibility pool for students, and funding formulae. Those are the big issues. On mission, I described how it broke out. And they finally had to make one agreement between the California State Colleges then, now the California State University, and the University of California, because only the University of California could offer doctoral level work, and the state colleges wanted to be able to do so. So they struck a compromise. There could be a joint doctoral degree if both faculties agree. There have been some, but not many. Periodically, there's been a run on this by the state colleges, hoping to get the authority to grant the degree, but it's always been beaten back by the legislature with our encouragement. Finally, I would say that the arrangement was worked out principally through the goodwill of the interested parties and the skill of Clark Kerr, who was a nationally known and highly respected labor arbitrator. And so that was a big help on our part to have him there.
Thank you very much. Uriel Reichman, you have your job cut out now.
Yeah. My name is Uriel Reichman. I'm the president of the first private university in Israel. And I wanted to ask you, what is the role or what is the relationship between the public and private institutions, and whether state is supporting private universities?
Thank you. This was a point of some stress at the time of the master plan, but it's really less of a problem today than it was then. The problem when it was first enacted was a fear on the part of the private universities that especially the University of California would be coming in seeking funds aggressively from the private sector and competing with the private sector support of the private institutions. So they struck a deal between the University of California and the private colleges and universities of the state that the university would confine its fundraising to alumni, by and large, of the University of California, leaving the field to the private sector for every other possible donors. That broke down over a period of time. But as it broke down, the private sector realized that if the University of California could be successful in seeking money privately, rather than shrinking the pool of people interested in the private sector, it tended to expand it. So competition here, rather than being hurtful to one or the other, has proven to be enormously beneficial to both, each now setting records. The University of California, for example, raised $1.1 billion last year from the private sector. And the private sector does even better. And that's great as far as we're concerned. Secondly, the University of California supported the provision of state funds for scholarship support for students attending both the public sector and the private sector, and the amount of money for the scholarship was to be tied to the levels of tuition. So the tuition at the private institutions being multiples of what it is at the public sector. The private sector benefited substantially, but the public sector also got public support for the most needy students albeit at a lower level because our tuitions and fees were a fraction of the privates. So we've been supportive of that over the years consistently. So there are ways and means of cooperating, and I would say that generally speaking, whatever the apprehensions and concerns at the outset, those generally speaking have been relieved, and the relations between the public and the private universities are really quite excellent at this point.
Thank you. Questions? But people are thinking, I wanted to ask one more question. How is the $14 billion total budget being divided between the various sources of income?
I just happen to have the answer to that. Thinking you might be asking it. Let me see. Well, student tuition and fees is $1.4 billion. Grants and contracts are $3.9 billion. Income from our medical centers, hospitals, clinics, and so forth, $5.5 billion. State funding is $3 billion. Private gifts is $1 billion this year. Last year it was a little less than that. No, it was $1 billion put together. Operating and capital, private is another $1 billion. And the Department of Energy labs are $4 billion. Hope that adds up to roughly what I said it was.
It seems that it does, but it's amazing that the state support is only 3 or 4 billion. 3 billion out of the 14.
Yeah, but the point there is state support is what we feed off everything else. I mean, it's the core support. It's the instructional support. Their willingness to fund a very low student-faculty ratio, their willingness to provide the physical plan, at least in significant part, their willingness to provide the computer facilities, the laboratory equipment, the clinicals, and the medical, so forth. We then feed off of that investment for purposes of securing grants for research from the federal government, persuading donors to come in and help us, charging sufficient tuition and fees that the students can help, support this. We have very efficient, by and large, set of self-supporting auxiliaries that I've mentioned that support a lot of the operations of the institution on a self-supporting basis. University Extension, for example, which has 350,000 students enrolled out of the state, there's no state money in it at all. It's all supported by the people who enroll in those courses.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the transfer of students between the 3 tiers of the system, something that I know we would be interested in?
Yes, thank you. It was essential in the master plan itself for this transferability of students to not only be agreed to, but to be real. And if it hadn't been for this possibility, the master plan would never have been approved. So you distribute the students at the freshman level in ways that I've already described. Top 1/8 are eligible for UC, although they don't all come to UC. Some go to the community colleges first, even though they're eligible for the University of California, for a lot of reasons. The California State University draws from the top 1/3, and the community colleges are open door. So the University of California's practice, although it's not inherent explicitly in the master plan, our practice has been to find a place for every eligible UC student at the freshman level. Not necessarily the campus of first choice, not necessarily in the major of their preference. They will be admitted to a campus of the University of California if they are eligible. If a student in the community colleges, for example, completes a course of study that is consistent with our agreements with the community colleges, we have articulation agreements with them, we will find a place, assuming they've achieved at certain levels, for every community college transfer student wishing to enroll in the University of California. Same thing true for the California State University. On the other hand, we give clear and distinct preference to students coming from the community colleges as juniors, and admit almost nobody coming from the California State University system. And as a matter of fact, you can't move until the junior year from one campus of the University of California to another. The point here is that if you're in the California State University, you are in a 4-year institution, you can get a baccalaureate degree. Whereas if you're in a community college and we turn you away, they're out of luck. unless they can go to a private institution. So we give them clear preference. And this hasn't always been a very easy arrangement because most of the students who come to the University of California as community college transfers come from a handful of the community colleges. They're not spread across the community college system because the quality of the students in those institutions is very uneven. And the transfer program in each of those institutions is very diverse. But that's the principle of it.
Thank you. Yes. Sheldon?
David, shalom from Israel. We miss you. Can you hear me?
Very well. I even recognize the voice.
Can you see me?
Less well than your voice.
Okay. There was actually, I'm not asking a question. There was a question asked earlier that had to do with the CSUC system, and you answered it, I think, essentially with respect to UC. So I'd like the lady who asked it to ask it again, right? Wasn't it? Am I correct? Was it? Yes, I was.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood or I didn't hear.
Thank you. I asked about the state universities and the faculty there. Do they have access to research? The state universities offer only a bachelor's degree, and the question is, what happens to the faculty in long term if they do not have access to research?
Thank you. I do now understand your question. Thank you, Sheldon. And for your question again, I do apologize. For the California State University system, they are funded by the state in ways consistent with the mission assigned to them. The mission is a full undergraduate program and selected master's degree programs, mostly in the professional fields. And so the funding per student is consequentially less in the California State University than for the University of California. And therefore the teaching loads are higher in the California State University system than in the University of California, but the research responsibilities are less in the California State University than the University of California. The research, generally speaking, is to be tied more directly to the instructional program in the California State University and is to be of a more applied kind than in the University of California, where there's a more generic interest in basic research, not necessarily tied to any particular program. So there are those differences, and inasmuch as much of the faculty of the California State University receive their doctoral training at the University of California, you can imagine that there's certain aspirations on their part for modifying the master plan and to allow more research in these institutions and less teaching and more of a UC model than a CSU model. And that's ongoing tension, and the state, generally speaking, likes the way it is because it costs more for students at UC than it costs for students at CSU, and they don't want to see them getting into business. So that's where it is.
Thank you very much. Any more comments, questions?
Moshe Ahrens, I'm the chairman of the board of the College of Judea and Samaria in Ariel. Who determines what graduate degrees can be given by the state universities?
You mean the California State University? Well, the California State University has the authority to make that judgment within the mission assigned to them. With the decision of CSU being reviewed by the Coordinating Council for Higher Education. It's a post-secondary coordinating committee for the state, which is in disfavor at the moment. But historically, this has been a coordinating body that reviews these decisions, including ours, and CSU's and the community colleges, to make sure there's not excessive duplication or unwise decisions being made with respect to the quality of the programs being offered. They offer independent advice to the legislature. The other difference is that unlike the University of California, which receives a block grant from the legislature, where they don't indicate what they're sending their money for. They're not providing money for this school or that department or that college or that campus. For CSU, it's completely different. Their budget is really a series of line items where the state legislature specifies what the money is to be spent for. And that would then pertain to any hope on the part of the California State University, for example, to offer a master's degree in engineering at Cal State Fresno or at Cal State, wherever it may be. That has to be funded by the state explicitly, or they can't offer it. Whereas in the University of California, the regents have the authority to make the decision. We get a block grant, and then we decide how to fund it.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that the Misha Arens, who introduced himself as the chairman of a college in Israel, is the former Minister of Defense of the State of Israel.
Does that mean that the legislature determines what graduate degrees to be given by the state university?
That's what I understood. Yes,
I can answer that if you'd like.
yes please.
Yeah. The answer is yes, because you can't mount the program without the money. That's for the California State University. That's not true for the University of California.
Big difference. Any more questions? Yes.
I answered that question reluctantly, having been an enlisted man in our Army. Only an enlisted man.
Meir Tzadok, the Israel Academy. Question about funding. You mentioned a figure of $5 billion for medical faculty, which is really a huge amount. Is it subsidizing the system, other faculties, or it covers its full cost, because it's a really big chunk? And if you can elaborate about the division between the various campuses, Berkeley, for example, how other universities are getting their funds?
I want to make sure I understood your question about the medical schools. Could you just repeat that part, please?
You mentioned the figure of in the income of roughly about $5 billion, which is really far more than the money that is given by the state. I just wonder whether it covers the full cost of the medical school, or the system is also being subsidized by other means.
Thank you. I do understand your question. Thank you. The funding for the medical school arises from a combination of sources. The faculty positions, the professoriate positions in the medical schools, are funded by the state. The research positions, for the most part, are funded by research grants from the federal government, National Institutes of Health, and so forth. The hospitals are run from the fees paid by the patients and by Medicare and other federal or state programs for those unable to pay, and by gifts from friends and alumni, and from the clinical services that are provided by both faculty members on the regular professorial scales and by faculty members who hold clinical appointments and whose salaries are paid by the fees of their patients, not by the state. So if you're a clinical professor of medicine at one of our medical schools, generally speaking, your support comes from the fees paid by the patients you see in our hospitals and clinics. If you're a professor of medicine, your salary is paid by the state. There's some exceptions to that, but that's the general rule. Oh, and I might also add that some portion of the money that comes from patients goes into foundations that are run by the various medical schools to help support a range of activities and services that are otherwise not provided for from any other fund source.
Thank you. A follow-up question for Michelle.
I have one more question. Can a state university advance the status of a full university, and what would it have to do in order to promote itself?
You mean can the California State University become a doctoral granting institution?
Right.
The answer is no, unless the legislature should amend the master plan so as to permit it.
So this will have to be a bill in the legislature that would have to be passed?
It would have to be an amendment to the California Master Plan for Higher Education. And it would have to pass the legislature. It would also have to be signed by the governor. And I could assure you the University of California would not be indifferent to this prospect.
Thank you.
Nor ineffectual in dealing with it, I might also add.
Okay, if there are no more questions, first of all, I would like to thank Sheldon and Martin for bringing you to us for this session, and thank you for this audience and myself for spending your Sunday night with us here Monday morning. So it was extremely useful. I think we learned a great deal from this discussion, and we thank you so much.
Well, you're very welcome.